Our top story this hour: Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu testified in court today. He has pled not guilty to all corruption charges leveled against him. This trial comes just 6 weeks before he faces re-election. There are currently 3 cases against the 71-year-old Prime Minister, who is the first Israeli premier to be indicted in office. He has been charged with allegations that he accepted improper gifts and sought to trade a regulatory favor with media moguls in exchange for positive coverage. Netanyahu has denied all these allegations, calling the charges fabricated, and claimed to be the victim of a witch hunt. Today's session marks the beginning of the trial proper, with subsequent hearings to focus on testimony and evidence. The trial schedule may force Netanyahu to appear in court multiple times a week as he campaigns ahead of Israel's 4th election in less than 2 years, to be held on March 23rd. Meanwhile, corruption case has had a polarizing impact on Israelis. Thousands of demonstrators gathered outside the court demanding his resignation. Netanyahu has called the protesters anarchists, accusing them of failing to take COVID precautions and seeking to topple a democratically elected leader. And for more on this, we are now being joined by Jody Cohen, who is an international affairs expert from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, the trial resumes just weeks before national elections, in which he hopes to extend his 12-year rule. How do you assess the impact of this?
So I think much of the Israeli public has already made their decisions and come to their own conclusions with regard to this court case. I mean, this has been going on for months already, and it is projected possibly to last for as long as another 3 years. We know from a poll that was reported in the Jerusalem Post newspaper today that despite the allegations against him, the Prime Minister Netanyahu is expected to win the next election, which is on March 23rd. He's expected to win 30 seats in the next parliament, with the nearest rival, Yesh Atid, the opposition party at the moment, expected to receive 18 seats. And historically, the Israeli government has always had to pull together a coalition. So if you have a look at the religious and right-wing parties that have, in the last few elections, come together as a coalition government, they're expected to win about 50 seats. And then if you have a look at the opposition parties and the coalition government, they could get 52 seats. And I'm purposely leaving out one party, and that's the Yamina party, because they are thought to be, Naftali Bennett is the head of that party, and he's expected to be the kingmaker in this election. And we don't know yet whether or not he will go into coalition with Prime Minister Netanyahu or with the opposition parties.
All right. And also Israel's longest-serving leader, also the first sitting prime minister to go on trial for corruption. What can we expect from this trial? He stands accused for fraud, breach of trust, and accepting bribes in 3 separate cases.
Right. So Prime Minister Netanyahu, today it was his second appearance in court, and he confirmed the response filed by his lawyers. So in other words, he said that he believes he is not guilty as charged. He has said, he didn't make a big speech in court today, but he has expressed previously that he believes that this is a political court case against him, and he believes that this is a witch hunt. His defense lawyers will be using procedural arguments, saying that witnesses haven't been handled correctly, and they'll also be using precedential arguments, saying that never before in Israeli history and across much of the world has a politician seeking positive media coverage been defined as bribery. Then again, his detractors will say that he has been, these charges are alleged against him, and even supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu, some are saying that the Prime Minister needs to be able to run the country. Obviously, Israel is facing a serious situation with COVID-19, with the economy in decline, and with the usual security challenges. But then his supporters say that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been able to cope over the past several months with pulling his defense together for this court, and in fact will argue that Prime Minister Netanyahu was personally responsible for negotiating with the head of Pfizer and doing so well in those vaccine negotiations, exchanging access for Pfizer to Israel's medical records in exchange for getting fast access to the vaccines. They would point to the Abraham Accords, and they would also point to the fact that while the economy is in decline, it isn't as in decline as one might expect given the global pandemic and the scale of the suffering many people across the world, both in terms of health and financial concerns.
All right, Jolie, that's quite a clear rundown of what the trial may look like. Also, you just mentioned this, and I was going to come to this next. Israelis have held protests calling on him to resign over the charges and are criticizing his government's response to coronavirus crisis. And Israeli law requires cabinet ministers to resign charged with criminal offences, but it does not specifically address the case of a prime minister under indictment. What can you tell us about that?
You're right. So the law does state specifically that if a minister is facing charges of crimes and indictments, then a minister must resign. But it doesn't specify that for the prime minister, which is why Prime Minister Netanyahu has been allowed to continue in his position and indeed may possibly win in the next election that's coming up, depending on whether or not Naftali Bennett decides to support Prime Minister Netanyahu or the opposition. We know that we know that Naftali Bennett has been close to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the past, but they did have a falling out. We know that Naftali Bennett is also close to the leader of the opposition. He hasn't specifically said that he won't sit in a governing coalition with the Prime Minister, as other heads of parties in the opposition have specifically stated. So it needs to be seen which way he will go and whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu will manage to get 61 seats together to form the next government.
Yes, Jody. All right. Thank you so much for joining us with all those details.